So, welcome to this episode in which I'm going to talk about the novelist Dave Eggers, and in particular this book, Your Fathers, Where Are They? And the Prophets, Do They Live Forever? Yet another one in Eggers' baffling titles such as And They Shall Know Our Velocity and things like that. Eggers is a writer who gets a lot of clog from people, partly because of they think he's pretentious, as implied by his titles. His memoir was entitled A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, and I've not read it. I don't know if that's ironic or not. And I think people have reacted rather badly to that. But they also, some people feel that Eggers is sort of a bit sort of intellectual and a bit arid emotionally. I think that's unfair. I think he gets a lot of clog because he runs McSweeney's, which is a very influential literary journal on the west coast of America, and I think they're inevitable enemies of people who've been turned down for his magazine, and enmities have arisen. Anyway, so I've read virtually every one of his fiction books, and I think he's become a different kind of writer from his early days. So I think The Circle, for example, is a brilliant sort of lacerating vision of the whole sort of tech company campus notion, where he basically writes it as if basically that the people who live on those communities or part of those communities are effectively in cults, because they have to sort of get in with the wacky corporate lifestyle aspects that they're no different from members of a cult. And I think it's an eviscerating piece of writing on where we're heading in sort of corporate culture of tech companies and so on. I think it's an excellent read, and the point is utterly unpretentious, which is, as I say, what Eggers has been accused of. And then the last one of his I read was A Hologram for the King, which wasn't quite as successful. Again, it's the sort of the corporate culture of trying to sell to the huge wealth that's in the Gulf states, who are sort of building these fantastical sort of creations of cities and built out of reclaimed land from the sea, or they're sort of the pretentiousness of wanting to sort of create their own sort of global continent in their image. It's not God or tectonic plates that made continent shapes. It's these guys can artificially recreate it. So on all of that, I think Eggers was very strong. I mean, the premise of the book is an American guy goes out to Saudi to give a presentation in sort of hologramic form to the king, to basically sell them a business idea, and he's just kept waiting forever and ever and ever in a sort of half tent, half modern sort of high tech society, and he's just completely sort of falls between these two stalls, and he's waiting for it's a bit like waiting for Godot. He's waiting for this cool visit for the king, and it sort of, is it ever going to happen? So I think that's very successful. What's slightly less successful is his personal story of the daughter he's left behind and the relationships there. And it's true, they're not as convincing. So potentially, I don't think it's because he's emotionally cold. I just don't think. I think the tech side was better rendered than the human side. But then we come to this, which yesterday I picked up because I had to wait in a shopping centre for an hour and a half before an appointment. So I needed something to read, and I bought this and read it in a day, and was really, really pleasantly surprised. So the premise of the book is that a guy has on the west coast of America has taken hostage an astronaut, and he's chained him to a post that's in an ex-military base that has been abandoned, this sort of huge expanse of space. And the post itself was used to sort of tether cannons so that when they recoiled from their fire, but they didn't sort of shoot off forever, they were sort of held back by this chain, by a chain attached to the post that now this astronaut is. And the guy is interrogating him because he claims that he was a sort of mentor figure for him, and initially the astronaut doesn't remember this guy at all, and that the astronaut has dreams of being in space, of going of reaching for the moon, and he never got those dreams because obviously moon shots stopped, and then it was things like sort of the shuttle and now the International Space Station, and the interrogator sort of feels to the astronaut that, you know, he was all lined up to go on the shuttle, and then the shuttle program was closed down, and instead it became like a museum piece. That it was sort of, instead of being this sort of great feat of human achievement and engineering, it sort of, you know, piggybacked on the back of a jumbo jet and sort of doing a sort of round of, you know, like sort of, you know, freak show public appearances. And the interrogator is more upset than the astronaut. The astronaut still has dreams that, you know, he can go out into space. That's what he's been trained for. And he sort of believes that he can get to the a posting on the International Space Station. But to the interrogator, that is sort of a very sort of second-rate version, because he's going to need to fly on a Russian rocket because the Americans they've cut back so much. So this is what the tenor of their conversation is, and there's lots of stuff about, you know, obviously the astronaut is very unwilling to sort of answer. He doesn't like the situation he's in, and there's the threats to the interrogator to sort of make him answer these questions. And, you know, it's an interesting sort of little sort of scenario. The whole book is in dialogue, because what's really interesting is that conversation sets off in the mind of the interrogator that he needs to talk to someone else in addition. And what he does is he goes and kidnaps a second person, chains them to a post in the next room, and starts interrogating them to get some of the details that are missing from the first interrogation. And this constantly happens throughout the book. And, you know, I think that's really funny. You know, it's not funny on one level, obviously, because, you know, this is a sort of unhinged mind. And these people are sort of, you know, held captive against their will. But actually, I found that the tension of the book is, oh my God, who's he going to kidnap next? And, you know, are we ever going to get to the bottom of what's bothering this guy? You know, why he's got these series of interrogations. So the next guy that he kidnaps is a US congressman. And he's a Vietnam vet. He's lost both his legs. He's a paraplegic. So they're sort of uncomfortable that he's being chained to a post. But this congressman is full of humanity. Actually, the exact opposite of what you expect a politician to be. He's full of humanity. He feels for the interrogator, wants to help him in obviously his time of sort of turmoil. And the questions the interrogator has to him is, well, why do we spend so much money on wars abroad when, you know, that instead of sort of either, you know, our sort of great illustrious you know, projects in space, or more pertinently projects at home? And they have this sort of conversation there, and the congressman explains how it happens, and it's much easier to get investors of government bonds to back wars, which in theory are finite, than it is for them to get to roll out money for, say, a social welfare project, which is sort of amorphous and will be ongoing, which is obviously not the message that the interrogator wants to hear. And it's at this point you realise that the interrogator represents a class of white male, sort of youngish, approaching middle age, completely out of sorts with society. They have no identity, no purpose. They don't know how they fit. And this guy goes on to talk to the congressman in terms of, you know, I need a war to be in, or I need some great national project, you know, some great sort of equivalent of the FDA going constructing the Tennessee dam or whatever. And you realise that actually this is quite prescient, because these are the people who rally to Trump's side. You know, people who feel they don't know what their stake in America is. They don't know what their place is. Now, there isn't any of the sort of race and ethnicity that was also in the Trump side of things, but I think that's sort of quite sharp. And it's you know, the beauty of this book is that the protagonist sort of is interrogating 5 or 6 different people, and he's obviously, you know, mad, because this is the way, you know, he tethers people to a post. But Eggers allows much more ambiguity and nuance. You know, I recently read the Victor Pelevin book, Hamlet, and the problem with that is that was just Pelevin talking at you, his ideas, and there was no, you know, as a narrative novel, it was a disaster. It was just the author talking at you about these ideas that interest him. Eggers here is beautifully wrapped it in a novel narrative structure to talk about ideas, but because it's nuanced. So, for example, the fourth captive is the protagonist's mother, and she gives the opposite or an alternative version of a lot of the events that we've been introduced to by the protagonist. and saying, no, it's not like that, and you've perceived that wrong, or you've remembered it wrong. And that's what I'm saying, that it's both sides of the argument are on offer in this book, and that's quite an achievement. So the third captive is an old teacher of the protagonist who was a suspected child molester. They used to have what he called sort of math sleepovers, where he'd invite young kids over, ostensibly to teach maths, but they would stay the night with him, and not only that, they'd be in his bed. Now, this is a really interesting section, and it's interesting that this character, Mr. Hansen the teacher, he only gets one section in the book, which is this one, whereas all the others, the protagonist sort of goes back to when he's got bits of information because someone else has clarified something or thrown up something he wants to check. Mr. Hansen doesn't, and Mr. Hansen gives a very, very nuanced defence, saying, yes, I behaved inappropriately by this mere fact of having boys round after school to my house, sharing my bed, but no, I never touched them, I didn't rape them. It's uncomfortable because, where is the line drawn? I mean, clearly, the mere fact of inviting sort of unchaperoned boys back and then sharing your bed in a sleepover is inappropriate. But this guy sort of says, well, I did have to resign my job. I recognise I was inappropriate, but I did nothing over and above that. And of course, to the interrogator, who once went to one of these mass sleepovers, which is why he's interrogating him, that's completely not acceptable. No, it must have gone further. You must have done more. And it's a very interesting, it really makes you think, because you hate Mr. Hansen because he's a proto-pederast, but he mounts a credible defence because, he did cross the line, but not so much that you would straight away go, no, you're a monster, you reject him out of hand. So it's a slightly standalone section, but it's, it was fascinating. Then the mother is the fourth captive, and that's just for, she knows she's a sort of addicted to drugs and drink and had a sort of hippie lifestyle, was, made mistakes as a mother. But she's very firm that his version of his memories is mistaken in so many ways, and that this whole situation he's got it wrong to her mind. And then the fifth and sixth captives are, the fifth is a cop, and the sixth is a hospital receptionist. Because one of the things that's really been bugging the protagonist is a friend of his who was a Vietnamese American, same age, 2 years ago was killed by cops. And it just so happens that the cop that he kidnaps miraculously was one of the cops in attendance on that night, and actually was responsible for one of the bullets that killed the Vietnamese guy. I think some of the energy leaks away from this section for two reasons. One is, and it's not Eggers' fault, this was published in 2014, and of course since then we've had Black Lives Matter and the whole thing about sort of cops killing people for racial profiling effectively. And that's completely overtaken this. Even though this guy's sort of Vietnamese American, it's not really about his race. So that's unfortunate. Eggers isn't in control of that. And the second reason is because there's always been a sort of give and take in the previous interrogations. That at points the captives go, no, I'm not giving you this, or no, you're wrong, I disagree with you. Particularly the congressman, because he's arguing from a position of morality and stuff. With the cop and the hospital receptionist, they are giving answers as if it was an interrogation in a police station. They don't really have any room for manoeuvre, and I found that less convincing, because basically the protagonist's mind, his friend was murdered by the cops, and they've covered up, the story to protect themselves. And the hospital receptionist, who was on duty the night the shot guy came in, it's part of the conspiracy. I'm not going to drill into too much of that because I think it would be a spoiler effectively. But I found those two parts slightly less affecting. And then the last captive, in his downtime after the first captive, he's walking on the beach and it's completely desolate and isolated. but he sees this woman who's walking a dog, similar age to him, and she resembles an ideal of a woman who he's had in his mind, ever since childhood, and he can't believe it. And he goes back and talks to the congressman about this, and he says, is it the astronaut? Sorry, who about this? The astronaut. Oh man, you got to go and talk to her. You can't let this opportunity pass. Of course, the astronaut's just hoping that in talking to her, she then goes and raises the alarm. This is so isolated. What's this strange guy doing there? But because of the mindset of the protagonist, he takes this advice as genuine. So the second time, he actually does approach her and talks to her, and they seem to get on really, really well. And he establishes that she walks regularly in this place twice a day because she's walking her dog. So the first face-to-face meeting took place in the afternoon. So he resolves he's going to meet her in the following morning. So all night he's interrogating people. And then the next morning he goes and meets her, and basically he gets it horribly wrong. He sort of grabs her hand, and she says, no, what are you doing? And basically he blows it. And so what he does, of course, is he kidnaps her and tethers her to a post. And it's at this point, if you haven't already, you realise this guy's mentally disturbed. This is the only way he can seem to relate. And this is a book about, in some ways, not only the social class of white males who feel deracinated from American society, but also that tranche of mental illness that doesn't get recognised in America. It's behind so many of the mass shootings. This sort of pathological approach to relationships. If you can't have it your own way, and this sort of fits into his sort of saying, I need to be doing something either at a war or to be doing something, on a great scale for America. It's all part of the same psychology of sort of, narcissism and sort of, complete sort of self-obsession, almost to the point of solipsism. And, the final statement of that is that he kidnaps this woman who he, in some crazy way he thinks he loves, having only just met her, because she corresponds to an ideal that he's carried with him since childhood. So it really makes you think about the American psyche and the cultural context of that, of things like cop killings, of things like, constant wars, and, why are there so many sort of mentally damaged people in America? Well, how many soldiers have there been coming back from all these wars with PTSD? The terrible things they've seen that, have cracked their psyches. I think this is why I say that a lot of the criticism aimed at Eggers is really unfair, that he's pretentious. He isn't at all. The scale of this book and the tone of this book is very level. It's almost understated. And I felt that with The Circle, it was taking on a sort of, a cult community. But again, the language was very level, very sort of subversive, in that it wasn't overstated and overblown at all. And A Hologram for the King, also quite sort of matter of fact about all these sort of strange wonders of architecture and, sort of technology. So I think it's really unfair to criticise Eggers for being pretentious, maybe in his early work, but he's now, he's been writing however long he's been writing. He's a mature novelist. And the last three of his novels I've written, which are probably the last three he's published, I'm not sure of the chronology, I just think these are very understated but important little books. They're important in the way that I've sort of described Jared Kobeck, but Kobeck is much more sort of in your face with it, much more confrontational. These are sort of, eating away at you on a much sort of quieter, more subtle level. And, I thought The Circle was a brilliant book. This is not brilliant, but very, very good. One of the things that I say, I wasn't too sure about the police, the cop, and I keep calling it a hotel reception. It's a hospital. The hospital receptionist seemed to give him the answers that he was demanding. They didn't put up any kind of resistance, which I wasn't sure about. But the other weird thing that bugged me about this is these people are sort of tethered up for 4 or 5 days. What's happening with their toilet arrangements? It's never mentioned. Food is mentioned, water is mentioned, but not and that bothered me, partly because I've had an interesting online discussion with someone about the role of why toiletry is never really mentioned in novels, it's not a big issue for me, but because I answered a questionnaire as a writer on it, and then had to notice, well, in the most dire circumstances of being tethered in place and not being able to move, I did suddenly wonder, what were the toilet arrangements? But that aside, this is a. I really enjoyed this. I didn't give it 5 stars. I gave it 4 on Goodreads. But definitely the upper part of 4 stars. Anyway, okay, so that's it for this week, Dave Eggers. Thank you very much.